Relations in the city of Philadelphia. Prior to that, he was Chief Deputy Commissioner for the former City Commissioner Al Schmidt. Rebecca Carruthers is the Vice President at Fair Elections Center. Over the past 20 years, she's worked on political and government projects all across the country. She's managed or consulted on campaigns in over 24 states, including presidential and down-ballot races. To begin with, we'd like each of our speakers to provide an introduction. We'll then move into the questions. If you have questions for our speakers, please add them to the chat and we'll address as many as possible. It's now my honor to introduce Commissioner Bluestein for his introduction.
Thank you, Dani, and thank you, Ricardo. I'm really grateful to be here with you guys and talk about what's at stake in 2022. As way of background, I was Deputy Commissioner for the past 10 years in Philadelphia, and I worked with former City Commissioner Al Schmidt, who was the commissioner during that time. And our role in the Board of Elections for Philadelphia is to essentially run the election operations and voter registration for the whole city. And that's not just for local elections. We manage the city's operations for both state and federal elections as well. And the Board of Elections in Philadelphia is a 3-person board. There are 2 members from the majority party and 1 from a minority party. So our office represents the minority parties in Philadelphia. So we work very closely with our Board of Election members in a bipartisan way to make sure that the elections are being run efficiently and fairly, and to make sure that we are able to count every single ballot that is cast by eligible voters in Philadelphia. So, I'm happy to answer questions about past elections, especially I'm sure there's interest about 2020 and how it relates to what's coming up for the rest of this year.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Bluestein. It is now my honor to introduce Vice President Carruthers.
Hi, thank you, Dani. Thank you, Ricardo, for having me. I am so excited to be speaking to the Midwest team. I am a Midwesterner. I proudly hail from the great state of Nebraska. I went to Creighton University for undergrad and I went to Nebraska for law school. Can I just take a moment of personal privilege? Can you drop in the chat what state you're either from or the state that you're currently in? I'm just curious with who I'm talking to today. Okay, I see Ohio. Okay, Michigan, Missouri. All right, Wisconsin, Kansas. Oh, Nebraskan. Okay, Pennsylvania, from Texas, but live in Michigan for school. Indy. Okay, some more Ohio. Okay, I appreciate that. Also, my preferred pronouns, she, her. I know we're going to get into what's at stake, but to tell you a little bit about me. So when I was 20 years old, I was a junior in college. I got recruited to run for office. I'm going to say that again. I was 20 years old. I got recruited to run for office. My campaign headquarters was my dorm room. I raised $350 total. That isn't a lot of money now for a campaign, and it wasn't a lot of money for a campaign back in 2002 either. But I was too scared to ask for money because I was socialized and taught that you don't beg strangers for money. So I beat someone in the primary, surprise, surprise, because I knew to go knock on doors and show up where people congregated in that particular district for what I was running for. And so I did those things. I lost in the general election. I lost by 20 points. I still have the letter from the Secretary of State saying, congratulations on running, and by the way, you lost. And from that experience, what I really learned is that there's a lot that I didn't know. I mean, there's still a lot that I don't know now, even after over 20 years of being involved in this way. But it really taught me that I needed to understand the business side of how elections work. And I really need to have that grasp in order to really participate in democracy. So I'm so excited to be here with you all today to talk through what's at stake for 2022.
Thank you, Vice President Carruthers. That was a really fantastic story. We will now begin with questions. If Commissioner Bluestein can respond first to the questions, followed by VP Carruthers, then we'll go back and forth on who responds first. So the first question up is, what is your greatest concern going into the 2022 election cycle?
Sure. So first off, I just want to say, Rebecca, that story was amazing. I really appreciated hearing it, especially the part that stuck with me was about how, even now after 20 years, we still don't know everything. And even as an election administrator for the past 10 years, I'm learning new stuff every day. And, we learn more by expanding who we're interacting with and diversifying our engagement so we can learn from other people. And, continually learning is part of what makes managing an election so important, whether it's running as a candidate or running the administration of it. And to that point, I think for 2022, and I can only speak really from my experience in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, nothing about the law has changed from how we managed the elections in 2020. So all of the opportunities that existed in 2020 for misinformation and disinformation to spread, for challenges to people being able to vote, those challenges still exist. And unfortunately, there's a stalemate in the Capitol, and the legislature and the governor can't agree on any changes, which means from an election administration perspective, it's our job to do our job as efficiently and transparently as possible so that we can try and prevent some of the avenues for this misinformation to grow. So that's my biggest concern about 2022. And even now, there are some legislative days left in the calendar, but at this point, I don't really foresee any changes coming. So even though we are months away from the November election, we have to expect that we're going to be running this election cycle exactly the same way, which is very concerning.
Sure. When I think about 2022, I reflect on 2020. 2020 was a high watermark. We had so many people who showed up to vote, and we broke records in so many demographics of people who showed up to vote. So my concern, similar to Seth, is that there is disinformation and there's misinformation. The disinformation is the intentional misrepresentation of information around our democracy, and it's intentional. And then the misinformation is more where people are concerned and they don't know where to go. They're unsure about what is a trustworthy avenue to get information. And so combining disinformation and misinformation, I'm really concerned about the influence that young people will play in the 2022 election cycle, because we know this is going to be a turnout election. We know that particular political parties are going to really push for their base to turn out. And I really want young people to understand, the more you turn out to vote, the greater your influence will grow. Because a lot of times people just focus on the super voters, those voters each time there is an election that they turn out to vote. And we need young people to vote each and every time. Don't vote for political party, don't vote for the personality, but vote for your influence. And that's what happens when you show up to vote each time there's an opportunity to vote.
Right. And the next question is, what are you most excited about for the 2022 elections?
I guess I'll start this one first. I'm excited that even though we had so many attacks during 2021 to increase voter suppression across the country, I'm excited that our system isn't broken. Our system is still here. Our system is still functioning. And that's the reason why I want as many people as possible to participate, because our system is resilient and our system is going to ultimately be able to withstand the disinformation and the misinformation. But I'm excited that we still have another opportunity to vote, another opportunity to make a difference and make sure our voices are heard.
I think that's a great point. It's, even though we've seen data and reporting on the fact that we've lost 50%, 60% of experienced election administrators who have retired, they're just they don't want to do the job anymore because of the threats and the underfunding and the challenges associated with it. The fact is that, there are, we're still here and we are still able to run elections and, engage with the community and students and, people who need to have their voices heard. And part of that is not just showing up to vote, but it's also engaging in the process. So, as an example, when I was a grad student, I went to University of Pennsylvania for undergrad and grad school. I worked on a number of campaigns. I volunteered, I knocked on doors. And then, when I was finishing school, I worked on this campaign for Commissioner Schmidt to run for city commissioner to run the election system for the city. And that's how I fell into working in the elections office. I went to grad school for public administration, but, I didn't go into it thinking, oh, I want to be an election administrator. You don't really know how the elections are run, who's counting the votes, how they're counting the votes. You don't think about that. You just see the campaigns and the candidates, on TV or, with the lit that they drop off. But when you engage in the process, you can actually learn the best ways to get your voice heard and represent your interests. So, I'm excited that we have that opportunity to continue working with everyone for November towards that end.
Great. I really love the messages of opportunity and resilience in there. Would you go in a little bit deeper about what threats you see to the election process?
Yeah, so in some narrow instances, you have attempts to run candidates or appoint individuals who are not committed to democracy. You see that there are some candidates running, expressly on the platform of being able to overturn elections or not count ballots from, legitimate ballots from eligible voters. And, that is a threat. There's the broader threat of laws that are passed in certain states that could impact the ability of individuals to vote, make it harder for them to vote. And then I think the biggest threat is one that we've already touched on, which is that misinformation and disinformation. Because even in locations where you have elections officials at the local or state level who are committed to running the elections fairly, that are committing to getting every vote counted, every voice heard, even where the laws are relatively permissive on getting those ballots counted, the threat of disinformation, misinformation still is there. And it is really hard to combat that. The famous saying, by the time the truth gets started, lies are already halfway around the globe. So that threat right there is the hardest one to combat, and it's the most pervasive from what I can tell.
Yes, echoing what Seth is saying, people just don't know where to get reliable information. And one thing that we noticed, especially with the work with Campus Vote Project, is that we noticed that college students feel comfortable about the information that they're receiving from their respective institutions. And so just looking for more ways of making sure that institutions are putting out accurate information on how to register the vote, when, and also publicizing when there are opportunities to vote, or even if students want to get involved and become poll workers, because as Seth has mentioned, there has been a decrease in the number of people who have been interested in working the polls on election day or leading up to election day. And so I think if we partner with trusted sources like institutions, like different community groups that are deemed trustworthy in the localities where they're located, I think those are ways that we could get around some of the disinformation, some of the misinformation. Earlier, I mentioned about influence, and how if you vote each time, it increases your influence. People understand, hey, that's someone who's always going to turn out to vote. But we also have influences in our personal spheres, whether it's within our friends or with our family. We should make sure that, when we have accurate information, we need to make sure that it's not just us with access to that information, but making sure that at least one or two other people around us also has access to that information.
All right, so you guys are both obviously very impressive individuals. Can you share with us one thing you're very proud of in your work?
You want me to go first, Rebecca?
Yeah, and then I'm still checking for myself. I'm like, okay.
So, having worked in election administration for the past 10 years, we've done a lot to keep elections secure and accessible and work with the public. The thing that stands out to me the most is a project that we worked on when Commissioner Schmidt was the commissioner, where we first came into office in 2012. And we conducted an investigation to see where voting irregularities were occurring, right? Because at the end of the day, and I use that word very purposefully, irregularity. I'm not using the word fraud. And the reason for that is because there are things that occur that have very clear explanations for why they're occurring. A lot of the time it's just confusion, or, something happens by accident. And sometimes it's fraud, but it's pretty rare. And in this scenario, what we found was that there were a number of non-citizens voting in Philadelphia's elections. And when I mean a number, I mean a few hundred out of hundreds of thousands of votes cast. And we wanted to figure out, well, first off, why is this happening? How can we prevent it? And what is the impact, not just on the election system, but for these individuals? And we took an approach to this that I thought was very responsible, where we found out that the reason this was occurring was because voters who were non-citizens, but who were legally present in the United States, would go get a driver's license. And when they would go submit their paperwork to get a driver's license at one window, they would register them and give them a card and say, okay, go get the actual license over at the other counter. And when they would walk over to the other counter, one of the things from the motor voter law is that they would ask you if you want to register to vote. Well, for an individual who's new to this country, and possibly one who doesn't speak English very well, you're going to a government entity and presenting your information to get a driver's license, and they're encouraging you to register. You don't know any better, you register to vote. And the impact of that was that these individuals were registering to vote, and then they were having a hard time becoming citizens, because one of the questions that you get asked during your interview process is if you've ever registered or voted in an election, because you aren't supposed to if you're not a citizen. And what we ended up doing is we actually were reached out to by an individual who this had occurred, and the commissioner went out and actually testified in his case to defend him and explain that the system was the problem, not these individuals. These individuals were not maliciously trying to vote in our elections. They're not trying to commit voter fraud. They, like anybody else, are trying to be good participants in our community and in our society. And we were able to go and defend this individual and actually help him be able to remain in the country and stay on his path to becoming a citizen. And, the reason that that's so meaningful to me is because we're able to take seriously voting irregularities without sensationalizing the impact on the individuals and creating more problems. And we're actually able to solve solutions at the government end, where we were able to get the state DMV to stop doing this process. And we were able to help the individuals who, did this, action at no fault of their own. And that's really one of the things that stood out to me over the past 10 years that I'm the most proud of.
One of the things I'm most proud of, one reason why I started off the story about being a college student and being recruited to run for office is that at the time, I didn't perceive there were a lot of opportunities to really get heavily involved in the process. And I most certainly didn't understand how it could turn into a career. And so I'm most proud of that throughout my career, I've looked for opportunities and ways to get more people involved in the process, especially those folks who are trying to figure out, how do I get involved, whether it is the pure electoral, the campaign side, or if it's like the policy side, or if it's the advocacy side. And so about 10 years ago, I got recruited to go back home and run a congressional. While I was there was this college student who came up to me and was like, hey, how do I get on a campaign? What does that look like? So for the next cycle, I actually hired that person for a governor's race as I think this person's role initially was like communications assistant. Then this person became deputy communications director eventually. And that person was Simone Sanders. I was able to give her her first full-time campaign job. And so I'm very proud about that because you never know where you're opening up the door and you're providing opportunities for others. You never know where they're going to end up at. And now she has her own show on MSNBC. She has gone to do some really great things working in the White House, as well as she is now an author. She's written a book. Just so many great things. And there's other people like her who are less well known, but it's like you never know when you give someone a chance what that ends up looking like for them and how you could really impact someone's trajectory. And so for me, I'm most proud of giving other folks opportunities and just looking for ways to connect them to help advance them in doing this work.
Really great stories. Thank you both for sharing. Norma has put a question in the chat that it also stuck with me, VP Carruthers, when you said vote your influence. And I think you both touched on that a little bit. Can you share a little bit more about what that means to you?
Every year, every vote. There is some type of election almost every single year in this country. And if you research where you live, there's probably an election. There's probably some election that's happening in your state every single year. And so the more you vote, the more what happens is you're now able to hold people accountable because they see your track record for being involved. And it's more than just voting. So yes, you go vote. You also show up to whether it's a city council or a county commission meeting, you submit testimony, you get involved. Whenever there's an opportunity to get in front of that elected official, you show up, you get involved, and it really grows your influence because they now know you are a force to reckon with, that you are paying attention, that you are watching. And that's the whole point of civic engagement. It's not just voting, but it's more than that. But you do need to vote each and every time because that's how your influence grows. We all know this, elected officials reach out to you if you're a super voter. They're going to be in your face. They're going to try to call you, invite you to town halls. They're going to want to know what your opinion is. And I want young people to disproportionately grow their influence by showing up each time there's an opportunity to vote. Because when you show up, when you grow your influence, they have to listen to you. Like bottom line. But if you show up once and say, oh, I didn't get everything that I wanted, and then you don't show up again, these folks, these representatives won't view you as being influential. But if you are active and you show up each and every time, your influence greatly outpaces the influence of other people. And it's how you vote your influence and you're growing your influence. I hope that makes sense for folks.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Rebecca said. At least in Pennsylvania, there are elections every 6 months. There's a primary and a general every year. On the odd number of years, they are judicial elections or for the district attorney or for city council, mayor, county commissioner. And, those are the individuals who are most going to impact your day-to-day life. They are also the individuals for whom you can have the most impact when you're voting every election cycle. So if you only vote in presidential elections, or if you only vote in November of even numbered years for the midterm and the presidential, those local and state politicians and elected officials are not going to view you as a reliable vote. Your vote history, not how you voted, but how often you vote, is a public record that campaigns will get, and they will target resources and communications to the individuals and communities that are showing up even in those off-year elections. And it's really important to keep that record, ongoing so that they can see that you're an active participant in voting. And, that's the part that's the most important. If you skip those years, you're not going to be able to have as much influence on the people who can actually most influence your life.
So like we said, 2022 is going to be a big year. Which state or race are you most concerned about this year?
Seth, do you want to start with Pennsylvania? Because I think I have a long, exhaustive list of races that I'm concerned about.
Yeah, no, that's an easy one for me to go into what's going on in Pennsylvania, because we always talk about Pennsylvania is always in the top couple states that are going to be the most influential. Whether it's number 1 or number 3 or number 5. Pennsylvania is a large state. It is a purple state that can go back and forth. In this election cycle, we have both an open Senate seat because the incumbent Republican Senator Pat Toomey is retiring. He had done, a term limit promise when he first ran. So he stopped after 2 terms in the Senate. And then we also have an open gubernatorial seat. The incumbent Democratic governor is term limited, and he is not able to run again. So in Pennsylvania, you have 2 very significant seats up for election. It's one of the few seats that are potentially going to be able to be flipped from Republican to Democrat, which makes it extremely influential for control of the Senate after this year. And then, as we were talking, as I first mentioned in my first statement, how we run elections in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania is directly impacted by who the governor is. Pennsylvania has a pretty solid Republican majority on the legislature in the state House and state Senate. And then while we have new districts that might make it a little bit closer, it's likely Republicans will still control both houses, which means who the governor is has a major say on what laws get negotiated for how elections are run and who is able to vote and how they vote. So at least in Pennsylvania, both of those elections have major impacts, not just on 2022, but going forward as we start thinking about 2024.
Who controls the U.S. Senate is going to go through the Midwest. There are competitive U.S. Senate seats up and down all across the Midwest this year. And turnout, whether or not the same people who turned out in 2020 shows up for 2022, is going to determine which way those seats are going to go. And the reason why this becomes important is you have to think through what are things that you want. What are things that you're looking for? Is that something that you get with one particular composition of the US Senate versus another? And so start to connect those dots. But either way, whatever the policy outcome that you're looking for is going to be determined by who runs the Senate. Here's a great example. This week, we saw the Supreme Court confirmation hearing for Ketanji Brown Jackson. That went through the US Senate Committee on the Judiciary. There are a lot of other federal bench appointments, which is ultimately going to determine on things like as there's lawsuits around climate change, as there's lawsuits around environmental justice, racial justice, lawsuits even around whether or not probably some of the issues even with student loans are going to end up in the court. So there are so many things that are happening that will end up in the court. The US Senate has direct influence on what that court looks like. And then there's also things that the House has passed or things that the House would pass. But if the Senate doesn't pass those things, they never make it to the president's desk and they're never signed. And so when we think about different things that we say that we want, different values that we say that we hold, it's impacted based upon the composition of the US Senate. And once again, the Midwest is going to determine what happens with the US Senate. And that's what I think about a lot.
At this time, we're going to allow each of the speakers to give a closing statement before we move back to the general session. VP Carruthers, would you like to go first?
I just want to thank everyone for participating, for being here with the summit. It's so important. It makes me excited when I see people who are looking for ways to be engaged in our system, because that's the only way we can have a more perfect union. If you ever need to reach out to me, I'm sure Ricardo can provide my contact information, or you go to fairelectioncenter.org. My contact information is located there in our About section under staff. I always enjoy hearing people's thoughts on issues, and just any way that I could be helpful, any way our organization could be helpful and supportive, let me know.
And Commissioner Bluestein, the virtual podium is yours.
Sure, thank you. I guess I'll close out by emphasizing something that Rebecca mentioned earlier, but we didn't touch on too much, which is volunteering to be a poll worker. You know, we talked a lot about voting, and we talked about working on campaigns and engaging, you know, your elected officials. But one of the other things you can really do that's super important is being a poll worker. When I was a student in undergrad at Penn in 2008, I was a poll worker during President Obama's first election. And a lot of students voted in that election. And we were able to help our students vote by running the election properly on campus. So I think if you advocate for getting polling places on your campus, if you volunteer to be a poll worker and you're able to help your fellow students vote, you know, I think you'll learn a lot about the process and also be able to engage in a way that's, you know, very meaningful. So I just want to put that plug out there, because at least in Philadelphia, we're always looking for more poll workers. I'm sure every county is. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bluestein and Vice President Carruthers, for your participation today. At this time, we are going to move back to the general session. Thank you.